Hi, everyone. It's Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception Action Podcast again. In this video, I wanted to create this video. This is kind of goes on with my other skill acquisition videos, kind of an extension of the video comparing the two approaches. This one, what I wanted to do is kind of address a growing misunderstanding and a miscommunication about the ecological approach I'm seeing. And it's something that I've contributed to myself, I have to admit. But it's something that it's a bit concerning to me. So I wanted to address this and get this out there. And more importantly, also, I think this also applies to all evaluating all coaching methods and practice activities. I think there's some general principles here that we should take into account when thinking about that kind of stuff. So what I'm talking about here is the view that many people, I think, have that the ecological approach to skill acquisition, right, is just a set of alternative methods, right? So what it is just a set of different types of drills or practice activities we do in training, right? So it's just a different bag of tricks, essentially. So instead of doing drills, we play games. Instead of using verbal instructions where you tell an athlete what to do, we add constraints. Instead of using strict repetition, we add variability, et cetera, et cetera. I could give tons of examples of this. And so I think this is a very common view, as I said, that people have about what the ecological approach is. And from this there have been a few things that I've seen people on social media, people talking to me about it and things that I think are problematic and I want to kind of address, because my main point is going to be that this is not true. Obviously, that's why I say it's a misunderstanding. There's a lot more to the ecological approach. Ecological approach is not defined by its methodology, right? That's a key point there. So what I see, the first thing I see is I get all the time people on social media and people that contact me, they ask me, is this activity that this athlete is doing in this video or this description, is this an ecological training activity? Is this an ecological practice example? So the point here is that there's a binary decision here. Either something is ecological or it's not, okay? And a classic, a really funny example of this happened a couple months ago. There was a video posted by Stephen Curry where he was in practice. He was essentially repeating the same shot, that corner three over and over again. Someone was passing to him and he was repeating over and over again. And funnily, both kind of camps and skill acquisition used it to support their view. A bunch of people tweeted, look, this is repetition, right? He's doing the same activity over and over. He's drilling isolated practice, trying to get the myelin, so that you learn this rote repetition, automatic, all that kind of idea. At the other hand, people are saying, well, no, this is kind of repetition without repetition because he's getting passed to. It's actually representative of practice because sometimes you're open jump shots and so on. So there was kind of both. Funnily, it was both camps were kind of putting this forward as support. And I'm going to return to a specific example later on. The problem here, and as I said, this is a problem not just specific to the ecological approach. I know lots of people have raised this issue. And when I've done my practice activity analyses journal clubs, one of the things we talked about before we even started doing those was whether we should or not, because it's very, very problematic to take a practice activity completely out of context and evaluate it, right? Not know what its intention was and how it fits into the bigger training plan, right? So we need to be careful about that. And that's happening now, as I said, with the ecological approach. People are saying to me, is this an ecological approach? No, it's not a binary yes, no answer, right? There's not methods that are and there are methods that aren't, right? So relatedly to this kind of thing, is this ecological? Is this very strong belief that people have that if you're going to follow an ecological approach to skill acquisition, you're not allowed to, in those exact words, use certain coaching methods, right? I'm not allowed to talk to my athletes anymore. I'm not allowed to use verbal instruction. Things like imagery and mental imagery and demonstrating things for my athletes, those are out too, right? I can't do those anymore. I can't have a thing where I have really low variability. Those are all out. So the idea, the toolbox analogy of a coach, the idea that if I'm going to switch to using an ecological approach, my toolbox is going to be cut in half, right? Because I can't do certain things anymore. And, I'll talk about that in a second. So I think that's a common hindrance that people, are hesitant to jump in. So again, this extends from this idea that there are ecological methods, right? There's certain things that are, we put in a box, ecological methods, then another box, non-ecological methods. The third thing people feel, and this is again related, if I'm going to follow an ecological approach, I have to be completely hands off as a coach, right? This is another common misconception that's kind of extended from this view that there are ecological methods. So the key principle of ecological approach is self-organization. If I'm going to allow self-organization, I can't step in at all. It's completely hands off. And I can't give any guidance to the athlete. I have to let them figure it out on their own. And this is, I know I've commented on this multiple times that this is not the case, right? But I still hear this all the time. People say, well, we invest so much time in training, we're wasting it by letting an athlete just struggle and not getting guidance. Well, yes, you are, because that's not the ecological approach. Like adding a constraint is an example for me of being hands-on, right? It's just a different way of being hands-on. You're using a constraint to guide the athlete in a different way. And same with, you can use verbal instruction. So we need to get rid of this idea that ecological approach is hands-off coaching. It's less getting directly involved and less instruction, but it doesn't mean completely hands-off at all. That's a very big misinterpretation. The fourth one I'll point out is the old wine in new bottles idea. I've talked about this on the podcast before, and this is just wanted to, I think it fits in here. The idea that ecological approach, the methods that people are talking about in ecological approach, for example, small-sided games, like is a very one that a lot of people that support constraints approach talk about small-sided games. And people that see that, they're like, what? We've been doing small-sided games in smaller fields for years, way before your fancy ecological dynamics came along. So there's nothing new here. Let's move along. Again, why this is incorrect is because ecological approach is not defined by its methods, right? So ecological approach is not, we're not rocking up and saying we have a new coaching method called a small-sided game. No, that method has been around forever. What we're rocking up and doing is saying we have a new theory to understand why small-sided games work and how to develop them and how to change them, and how to use different variants of it. So there is new, that's what's new, right? Not the small side, not the method, the theory that guides the use of the method, right? That's what's new. And I'm going to get into that more in a second. The fourth one is, this is not problematic in a way, but it is in another. I get a lot of people, I hear a lot of people, okay, I'm really on board. I love this idea of self-organization, ecological approach. Okay, tell me the drills I need to use instead of the ones I'm doing now, right? The problem with that, and I get, there's on social media, well, show me examples in my sport. What should we be doing? The problem is there's no need. Again, ecological approach is not just an alternative set of practice activities, right? It's a way to look at any practice activity in a different light, right? So there are growing number of examples, and the one that I keep recommending is this great book by Ian Renshaw, Pete Arnott, and Graham McDowell on the constraints-led approach in golf. As I said before, even if you're not a golf coach or into golf, this is a great example of how to use a constraints-led approach and kind of think through it. The phrase I would use is ecological approach gives you possibilities, not prescriptions, right? It opens up a huge, massive range of possible activities you can use. It doesn't give you a prescriptive list of ones you shouldn't use or you need to use, right? So there's not a set of ecological methods again. That's the key point I want to make here today, right? It's not constraints. Here's the constraint you should manipulate for your sport and you're guaranteed for success. That's example. That's a possibility, right? Manipulating the number of players in soccer is a possibility for using an ecological approach in soccer. It's not the only way to do it. There's multiple other things you can be doing. So why has this happened? And I mentioned, I've contributed to this. I think this kind of belief, this in general, we're overly focused on methodology right now, right? We're contrasting, methodology and me and a lot of other people. We've talked about this in like I said, in the people I'm on the journal club, Stu Armstrong and everyone. It's come from a few things. One of the best ways to illustrate the differences in the theory is by taking a specific example, right? So we talk about, comparing the use of cones versus playing tag in soccer or playing games, right? We can illustrate the issues of coupling and specifying information. But it comes across, it gets, partly of our own doing, that cones is not an ecological thing. This other thing is an ecological method. That it persists this idea that there are ecological methods. The other thing that I find, I was talking about this with someone yesterday, is, this ecological approach is a big leap. We talked about this. It's a big philosophical change in how you coach. It's really a completely different worldview, as I keep saying. What I find with a lot of coaches, a necessary first step is to give a specific example, a drill, like try this in practice, right? Try this activity. So giving a specific example to get you to the bigger change in philosophy, it seems to be the gateway that you have to go through for a lot of people. So again, focusing on methodology, a specific methodology, when it's not defined by methodology is the key point I'm making. And as I said, I get a lot of constant call for examples, and that's fine. We're happy to give them. And you might notice sometimes we're hesitant because we want to make the key point that they're examples. They're possibilities of the way to do it, right? They're not the ecological methods, right? Ecological approach is not a hack, right? Of using, here's the 5 ecological methods, right? That's not what it is. So that's why we're kind of hesitant to give, specific examples, because sometimes I think people interpret it as that. Okay, so these are some of the things, the kind of issues that I see. So what's the alternative way of looking at this? And this is, again, all of these things are my interpretation of what the ecological approach is and what the constraints-led approach is. And I think it fits with a lot of the ideas of the other people, but there can be some differences. But for me, this is a better way alternative way of thinking at it. And again, this arose, a lot of this I shaped and helped me think about this with some discussions I had with people like Marion Davies and Carl Woods, right? So in my very first presentation I gave, the one that I know a lot of people have seen, where I talked about the differences between the 2 skill acquisition approaches, I put up this table, the information processing approach. And in that video, I used a tree analogy, right? I said, the methods are different. They're like 2 different trees because they have different roots. And for me, the roots are the nature of perception, right? Whether perception is direct and you just pick up information, or indirect and it needs to be enhanced or enriched by mental models, right? That makes the trees grow in completely different methods. So if I'm going to carry on this analogy, and again, Marianne was the idea of drawing it this way. So hopefully she's going to do a blog post on this eventually. But the trees, if they have different roots, right? The analogy, if we're going to continue on with the analogy, the branches are the methods, the specific methods, coaches' methods, constraints, imagery, demonstration, variability, all those things. They're the branches. And why I've drawn it like this is I want to make the point that the methods overlap, right? And what we're doing is focusing way too much up in the methods. Is this an ecological method? Is this not? Where it's really, they're defined by their roots, the theory. That's what we need to be focusing on. So from this, I want to pull out some key points that I think are really important, okay? So the first key point, for me, I think this applies here and to all coaching methods, right? A practice activity, when we look at a practice activity, we need to assess it and understand it by its trajectory rather than its current static position, right? So another analogy, a practice activity is a snapshot of a big movie, right? So to understand a practice activity, we need to understand, where did it come from, right? What is it trying to achieve? That's the roots, right? The specific method is the branch, But what are the roots? What is its intention? What is its purpose? What is it designed to achieve? Okay. The other thing we need to think about, so that's one direction of the trajectory. The other where do we want it to go, right? If we can use the analogy of a tree for the athlete too. In which direction do we want them to grow after this activity, right? Do we want them to come out of this activity with having a specific technique nailed and perfected? Or do we want them to come out with it having learned how to problem solve and have a better search process, right? So which direction do we want to grow, right? So me, that's much more important than focusing what are the details of the specific moment, this specific practice session. Thinking about its trajectory is way more important to me, in fitting it in the big theory. And I think if you think about this, this will make you a much more purposeful practice design, right? This fits in kind of with the general idea, not the specifics of it, but the general idea of deliberate practice, thinking about what the practice is for and where it's going, right? I think it's really critical. The second point I would make is that this idea of the reduced toolbox is not correct, right? Almost any existing coaching method can be used in an ecological manner, right? Right, because it's defined by its purpose. The purpose of in a manner for self. So you can use. I've talked about imagery on the podcast in terms of ecological view lately. I'm going to have a journal coming up where we talk about demonstration and observational learning. You can use those to help a person self-organize rather than use them to give a particular technique, right? You can use instruction to guide self-organization. You can use constraints to design, so almost any method you can think of can be used in a manner consistent with the ecological approach. Because the ecological approach to skill acquisition is defined by its roots, the theory, the philosophy of self-organization, of coupling, of information, of direct perception. It's not defined by its methods, right? The ecological approach is not the constraints-led approach. That's why they're not the same thing. Manipulating constraints is one thing you can do within the ecological approach, along with manipulating feedback, instruction, imagery, demonstration. All those are open to game, right? So you haven't reduced your toolbox at all. You just have to think about using them in different ways. Third point, this is where I think, I've been guilty of this too. And this is another problem with looking at a single practice activity like Stephen Curry's shooting and saying, is that more consistent with the ecological approach or information? Blah, blah. In my view, what I've come to think of this is if the theory of the roots, the trees are going to grow within the trajectory of training an individual athlete. What we're going to have is sometimes the methods are going to temporarily overlap. I think the batches are going to overlap. A good example of this might be direct instruction, right? So there might be some point in training where in both approaches, we need to step in and tell the athlete something. Maybe you should try bending your knees more. Most people think that doesn't fit with an ecological approach, but it does, because it depends on how you use it, what its purpose is, and I'll talk about this in a second, and where it's going next, right? That's what defines the ecological approach, not the method itself, right? And I said, I've been guilty of this. So the difference between the approaches in their philosophy, their trajectory, not the roots, not in the methodology, right? So if we look at a single drill, we might, we need to know where it's going and where it's coming from, right? Before we can evaluate it and do these things. So I think it's very dangerous to look at a single activity and say whether that's ecological or not. So this is an example that I wanted to give. There's maybe some points in an ecological approach where a person is struggling self-organizing. They're struggling coming up with a coordination solution that can achieve some level of proficiency. In the ecological approach, you're not precluded from stepping in with some sort of verbal direct instruction, right? People think you are, it's not allowed. What you have to do is you have to think about what the purpose of that verbal instruction is. If you step in and say, try bending your knees more, right? that's just one example. You know, there might be better. We could use an analogy or something like that, or an external cue. I just want to get the idea that why are you doing that, right? What are you doing it? Are you using it as kind of, if it's ecological approach, you can use that as kind of a guide, right? Your purpose is, here's something to try to help you in your search. You can think of it as a map. I'm giving you a little something to help you orient yourself within the search space. This, so it's the purpose is for guiding self-organization. And in Newell's terms, this is transition feedback, giving you feedback about where, helping you guide your search rather than give you the solution, right? So the idea here is it's a map to help guide the search. So rather than here's the solution I want you to use and stick with forever, right? So that's kind of the difference. Again, where it's coming from to guide search, where it's going. So if you use a direct instruction in the ecological approach, you have to be fully open to the possibility that athlete's not going to continue to do what you just said, right? They're going to find something that works better for them. Whereas in a more information processing prescriptive approach, you want them to stay there, right? Because the feedback is corrective, right? It's trying to get them to the right solution, right? So again, the method, when you look at it, direct instruction can be the same, but it's where it's coming from and where it's going, its trajectory can be very different. Okay? So again, to pull this all back around in full circle, I want to revisit the Stephen Curry example. It was funnily a few weeks after that video came out of him doing the same shot. So he was doing that same corner 3 over and over and over again, at least 10 or 12 times. There's a story came out where he commented on it and he said, I never do that in practice. I just do that in the warm up for a game to kind of, I forget what he calls it, a kinetic activation process to kind of get, activate, get loose. In practice, when he's actually improving his skill, he rarely takes more than a handful of shots from the same spot, right? And never runs traditional draconian hoops conditioning drills, such as wind sprints. So the point in this, there's a link to the article. That's a direct quote from the article, right? The point here is I'm not trying to say that Stephen Curry's way is the right way to do it. But what I'm saying is, here's an example where we looked at one snapshot. We looked at the branch and we didn't take into account the roots and the trajectory and how it fits in with the rest of the training plan, where it fits in and what it's designed to achieve, right? So I think the overall message I want to have today is, one, for any coaching method, you need to consider its trajectory, not just a static practice activity. But more specifically with the ecological approach is a philosophy that can be applied to almost any coaching methodology. It is not a set of methods. There's not a set of ecological methods. It's going to be some that are more consistent with it, but it's not just a set of methods that that changes your toolbox as a coach. Okay, so I hope this has helped kind of understanding it like this. As I said, this is something I've been thinking about, and I'm going to continue to expand on these ideas. I'll try to give some more specific examples of how you might, for example, we might use instruction as a map, that kind of concept. Hopefully I use that, talk about more of that in the future episode. So thanks for joining me, and cheers for now.